Welcome to My Business Matters, the Michigan Chamber podcast.
Hey, welcome to today's podcast. I'm Sara Wurfel, the Michigan Chamber's Chief Communications and Marketing Officer. We have some great guests. We're going to be taking a closer look at a host of pending legislation and how it might affect Michigan's business climate and the efforts underway to grow our Great Lakes state's population. It's the wonky concept of repealing local preemption laws, which is another way of saying that Michigan's 1,800 plus local units of government could each set their own rules and regulations. So with us, Wendy Block, our Senior VP of Business Advocacy and Member Engagement for the Michigan Chamber, Amy Drumm, Senior VP of Government Affairs for the Michigan Retailers, and Marcus Keech, the Director of Governmental Affairs for the Grand Rapids Area Chamber. Thank you all for being here. I know we got a lot to cover, and so let's just get started right away after I hit my timer here. Michigan has always been known kind of as a local control state, but a number of legislative proposals out there would give even more control to local units of government from that standpoint. Local employment laws, bans on auxiliary containers, items like to-go containers and plastic bags. The Michigan Chamber, the Grand Rapids Chamber, and the retailers are all opposed. Can you explain why?
Yeah, I think I'll start with that. So, what we're really talking about is who makes these decisions, not whether the decisions are made. And so what legislators are hoping to do is to give these powers to regulate these items back to local units of government. And you have a situation then where 1,800 local units of government across our great state could be making different decisions that businesses across our state need to comply with. And with all of these, we're concerned about the unintended consequences and the benefit of these mandates as compared to the costs that they bring and the impact they could have on our state, its business climate, population growth, et cetera.
I don't know, Marcus or Amy, you want to jump right into?
Yeah, so part of the problem is the details in these ordinances. If you've got multiple locations across the state, and you're trying to figure out which ones you're supposed to follow, what the rules are, if the definitions are different, if the record-keeping requirements are different, all of these pieces are contained in these ordinances, or could be. And that's why we had supported the original 2015 law to make sure that the state was the only jurisdiction who could cover these types of topics to prevent that confusion we've seen in other states that have gone this route of having local ordinances covering employment policies and containers and bags and the like.
Okay.
And to echo both Wendy and Amy, the Grand Rapids Chamber, we were supportive in 2015 as well of the original legislation. And when as the chamber, we look at what we can do to support our 2,500 different members in the Grand Rapids area, and to making sure that they're all on the same playing field and have the same regulations and regulatory policies they abide by, regardless of where they operate throughout the state. And sometimes some of these businesses, they operate in different municipalities on the same day. And so making sure that they can navigate that efficiently and effectively and actually have a market that's opportunity for growth and to be successful. And so it's an easy decision for us to be opposed to this legislation before us.
Got it. A couple of the numbers that have popped up, that 1,800 plus local units of government, right? I think Michigan is a little bit unique in that regard across the country, but that could probably be overwhelming, as you've briefly touched on. What kind of employment laws are we talking about? Like, what truly would be affected here?
Yeah, so things like a local minimum wage, sometimes referred to as a local living wage, paid or unpaid leave mandates, local prevailing wage laws, local predictive scheduling laws where people have to give schedules to employees X number of weeks in advance, and if they change, the employer is penalized with a higher rate of pay. What else am I missing, guys?
You're looking at, one that really, I think, speaks up is the local government's administrative and judicial remedies for these disputes as well. They have their own judicial process to have these hearings.
Oh, that's a good point. And I think, Amy, from retailers, but all of the members of the different organizations here that represent businesses across our state, what do you see kind of as particularly onus, or what these would do when you have multiple locations?
So a lot of retail employees work in multiple stores to get more hours, and they work across jurisdictions. Imagine if you're the HR department who's trying to figure out how many hours you worked in store 1 versus store 5 versus store 10, and then determine those benefits. Maybe for wage that's complicated but doable when you talk about things like paid leave or training requirements or other additional benefits, that becomes really complicated. Things like scheduling. How do you schedule that far out and determine the rate of pay if you change that schedule? So we are really looking at the implementation, particularly for a smaller retailer who doesn't have an HR department. That's maybe the owner who's having to do all of that themselves.
Right. Before we jump in, I'm going to kind of touch on a few other components of this, but there's also another kind of similar piece of legislation with these local ordinances on something called auxiliary containers. I think for a lot of our listeners, what actually falls under the definition of auxiliary containers, and why should we be paying attention to something like this?
So auxiliary container was meant to be a broad term intentionally. The reason we brought this bill up was originally about plastic bags. We were hearing a lot about plastic bags back when this bill was originally put into law. There were other questions about things like straws, as we all remember. But the definition itself includes a bag, cup, bottle, or other packaging, whether it's reusable or single use, made of a number of various components. It could be cloth, cardboard, plastic, aluminum, glass, recycled materials. And it's any of these items that you would use to transport, protect items that you're doing. So this is goods, foods, or beverages. So it hurts our friends with the food and beverage industry as well, not just retail.
And really becomes an issue where you may have consumers that don't have a good way to bring home their goods from a store. And so this says, well, maybe there is no plastic bags. And then that leaves people, and especially low income people, without a really good option other than paying for a bag that the store provides that is not single use. So this could end up hurting, many lawmakers' constituents kind of in the process.
That's a really good point. I think, Amy, you wanted to jump in with something there, too.
Yeah, so we've talked to our smaller grocery chains, the ones who have a regional chain with maybe 5 to 7 stores, and they've said that if you ban their ability to have plastic bags, they cannot get enough paper bags. They can't get paper bags with their logos on them. And so that is a real challenge. Not only are those bags more expensive if you go down this road, but you're not even able to get the bags that have your business logo on it to send it home with your customers. So you've got a real cost component, and it gets complicated quickly. I mean, you talk about retrofitting checkout lanes. I mean, we could go down the rabbit hole quickly here on how costly this can become.
Right. It becomes pretty obvious. And I don't know, Marcus, you looked like you were going to jump in there,
I
too.
was just going to kind of piggyback on what Amy was saying with this accessibility to getting these paper bags, and also with Wendy talking about some of the lower income and how they don't have necessarily the accessibility of these bags. And some of these populations, they take public transportation as well. So now you're asking them to also potentially take a public transportation like a bus, and they just can't physically move all that groceries that they purchased if they can't access the baggage needed. So it creates a whole trove of issues that potentially happens if we limit those bags.
You certainly, I think, are touching on this kind of like the unintended consequences
Certainly.
that sometimes that people don't necessarily think about, right? On its face, it sounds like this could be like a good thing, right? And then until you really start diving into these issues of all the things that could happen. So kind of on that note, it seems like some of these policies could actually backfire and have a negative impact in the communities that adopt them, and even the state as a whole. Would you say that's a fair statement based on kind of what we've been talking about here, and what else would you say and add to that?
Yeah, I think you're right. And we look at this from a number of perspectives. First, the local communities that choose to go down this route could very well be creating high cost islands for themselves, right? Where you have the cost of doing business in area A being severely out of whack with the cost of doing business elsewhere. And when that happens, that could discourage growth in that community. It could cause businesses to leave and to go to another jurisdiction where it's less costly to do business. You could have businesses closing shop altogether because they can't afford to move, and they can't afford the cost increases that are being pushed down on them. And, when these things happen, when costs go up for the business, that means that those costs are absorbed by someone else, right? It's usually not the business that's absorbing those costs. It's maybe that I have to reduce the size of my workforce. It may mean that I was planning to give my employees an increase in their wages, but now I can't afford to do that. It could mean that people pay more with menu prices, and it's just, higher menu prices. So those dollars that you're putting in someone's pocket doesn't necessarily translate in them having additional buying power, and kind of on and on and on. And I think what we've been trying to point out to lawmakers is that really the market is driving wages and benefits to all-time highs, well above kind of government minimums, the floor, just simply because we are facing such a severe workforce and talent crisis in our state, and that, just letting the market continue to rule. But certainly if someone wants to do this from a legislative perspective, we feel that those legislative discussions should be happening in Lansing or at the federal level, but certainly not at the state level, creating this patchwork scheme that creates an administrative nightmare.
Right. And I would say I'm going to actually kind of jump, thinking through that, of all the announcements recently in the last month about, I think, some overdue emphasis on Michigan's kind of dwindling population, right? When we rank 49th behind every other state except one, and we're losing population, we're losing congressional seats. What does this almost seems to fly in the face of that, and having a hard time wrapping my arms around this, because if you make it harder to do business, what's the ramifications? How would you guys see this? Does this help complement trying to be able to grow the state and economic development, or not?
Yeah, so I think for the Grand Rapids Chamber, we're in a unique position with West Michigan, because while the rest of the state's struggling with their population, Kent County, Ottawa County, we're actually growing. And we're really the only region that's doing that. And and a big reason why we're doing that is because our business market and the ability to grow business and lure population and talent to come to West Michigan. And with this ability of an increase in regulations at the local level, you're putting a screeching halt to all that. And so we need to make sure, like I said earlier, we need to make sure the market is favorable for business to succeed. And as Wendy was saying, all these different potential outcomes, the other side of it is our trades. And these are businesses that, as they go into different jurisdictions who might have to meet different parameters, those costs that they absorb, they're going to be passed on to the cost of the projects. And so if you want to hire a company to put a new roof on your house or anything, the individual costs are going to increase as well, as we're individually hiring those services. And so we have to think about not just project costs for constructions or other services. We got to think of the individual cost increase as well, and we will on an individual basis.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add, we've sat through now several rounds of committee testimony on this legislation, and, Michigan's state minimum wage is $10.10 an hour. It's increasing every year. But what we heard in committee testimony by local public officials is that they think it could or may be fully appropriate for them to raise their local minimum wage to $19, $22, $24, even $32 an hour. So, this is not fear mongering. This is the reality of what we might be seeing coming out of these local units of government, city councils and the like, but even at the township level. So, this is a real concern for our members just generally, and it's a concern for the future of Michigan's economic growth if we have these high pocket costs municipalities out there, and just what that could do to shun or stunt economic growth in certain regions of our state.
Right. I'm going to look to you, Amy. I'll say, from a standpoint of there either have been multiple legislative hearings, as we talked about, or slated on a couple of these other bills. Where do things stand? What happens next from your perspective? And then anybody else who wants to jump in as well.
So I'll start with saying I think we all would love to know where we actually stand with these hearings. It sounds like the thought process right now, given that they are about at the end of June and will hopefully go home for the summer for a few months to talk with their constituents, that they're teeing things up to move potentially in the fall. That gives us time to talk with people and committee members and lawmakers, and particularly for our members back at home to talk with their lawmaker directly about how these will impact them. And that's a huge concern. And I want to reiterate, too, that, we don't have good jobs without employers to employ people in those jobs. And people want to come live in communities where they have the necessities. If you have a food desert because you can't buy groceries, you can't buy shoes and clothing, that's really critical. And so people are moving to communities where they have those pieces in place. If we push them out, what are you going to do? You can't order everything online and have it shipped to your house and be happy with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Amy's right, though. It's sounding more and more like these bills will be considered come fall. And again, I think if we have listeners who are kind of thinking, gosh, this sounds kind of scary and I want to figure out how to make my voice heard, there certainly will be some coordinated activities come fall that the Michigan Chamber and these other organizations will likely be pushing out to their members. But in the meantime, just getting the ear of your local state rep or state senator and talking to them about the concerns that you may have with these bills would be extremely helpful. House Democrats do control that. House and Senate Democrats control their individual chambers by a 1-vote margin. So, there isn't a guarantee that this will pass, but I think we need to continue to spread the word about the harmful effects of this legislation and just get the collective voice going on this.
I think you probably did the perfect segue to wrap up, because that's exactly what do people know? Where do they go to get more information, and what should they do about it? So I'm going to give you guys the last word here.
Well, I'd say there's a lot of information on the Michigan Chamber's website at www.michamber.com. We'll also be sending out an action alert as we get closer to the fall. So an easy way to just send an email to your lawmaker to talk about your concerns. But I'll let our other guests weigh in with other thoughts.
Yeah, it's very similar. We also have information on our website. We're sending out information to our members. We certainly welcome more businesses to join as members of all of our groups, because that is how you find out about these pieces. And you can also get on your lawmakers' email list and find out when they're having their coffee hours and go and talk to them in person, invite them to your store or business to see it firsthand.
Yeah.
And the Grand Rapids Chamber has been very outspoken with our work on this policy as well. And just know that as you're diving into this and you're looking at this and you have those concerns, you're not alone. We have a coalition of organizations and chambers across the state that they have your back. And so don't hesitate to reach out to your chamber, reach out to your elected officials, reach out to us, and we will always be with you every step of the way as we combat these policies.
I think, and that is the perfect end. And with that, we're out of time. It always goes so fast. So thank you so much. Special thanks to Wendy, Amy, and Marcus for being here and sharing their expertise and the impacts that this could have. And to you all for listening. Make sure to tune into our next episode and subscribe or like our podcast for easy notifications. Until then.